Hello, my name is Beckett Callahan, 31 years old. I am an architect living in Burlington, Vermont, where narrow cobblestone streets wind between old wooden houses, where autumn blankets the maple leaves in gold, and winter is bitterly cold, as if the entire world is immersed in a serene painting. Burlington is not just a small city nestled by Lake Champlain. It is also the keeper of my memories both sweet and painful, like a healed scar that still stings when touched. Today I want to tell you the story of my childhood, about the summer when I was 13 years old, when my entire world turned upside down. It's a story about family, trust, and how a boy realized that not everything in life is as it seems. I was born and raised in Colchester, a small town just north of Burlington where everyone knew each other's names and stories about neighbors were often shared over lazy afternoons on front porches. Our house back then was a 2-story wooden home, not too spacious but warm enough with the meals my mother cooked and the sound of my father's laughter as he recounted his days as a freelance electrician. My father, Leonard Callahan, was a tall man with a deep, warm voice that could sometimes be a bit gruff. He took on odd jobs around the area, fixing electrical systems for neighbors, installing lights for a local grocery store, or sometimes just replacing a light bulb for the elderly lady down the street. His work wasn't steady, but he always took pride in saying he earned every penny with his sweat. My mother, Catherine, worked as a cashier at a small supermarket near our home. She was a gentlewoman who smiled often, but her eyes always held a trace of weariness, as if life was slowly wearing down her optimism. I was a good kid, or at least that's what the adults used to say. I loved reading books, from Jules Verne's adventure novels to the old science books my father brought home from flea markets. I was introspective, had few friends, and enjoyed sitting alone in my room imagining far-off worlds where I could be an explorer or a great scientist. Perhaps because of this, I wasn't very close to my grandmother, Helen Callahan. She lived in Heinsberg, a town about 20 miles from our home, and I rarely saw her. On the few occasions she visited, I vaguely recall a petite woman with neatly pinned silver hair, always wearing a gray sweater and speaking very little. She wasn't the type to hug or tell jokes, but every time we met, she would slip a piece of butterscotch candy into my hand, smile, and say, "Eat it, but don't let your mother see." I liked her, but we weren't particularly close. Maybe it was the distance, or maybe I was too young to understand her. From a young age, I heard my father talk about my grandmother as if she were a hero. She was a stoic, strong, and resilient woman. My grandfather, whom I never met, was an addict and a thug who made my grandmother's life a living hell. My father told me that my grandfather used to beat her and squander their money on alcohol and gambling. When my grandmother was 31, she decided to leave him, taking my father, then only 8 years old, with her and moving to a small house in Heinsberg. From then on, she raised my father alone, taking on all sorts of jobs, from sewing to selling goods at the market to make ends meet. "Your grandmother is the strongest person I've ever known," my father would say, his voice filled with pride. I didn't have many direct memories of her, but through my father's stories, I admired her as a symbol of resilience. I imagined her as a mountain standing firm no matter how fiercely the storms raged. My life went on quietly like that until the summer I turned 13. It was the summer of 2007 when everything changed forever. One evening, my parents called me down to the living room, their voices more serious than usual. I still vividly remember the nervous anticipation as I walked down the stairs, my flip-flops clacking against the wooden floor. My father was sitting in the armchair holding a can of beer while my mother leaned against the wall, her arms crossed as if trying to hide her anxiety. "Beckett," my father said in a low voice, "we're moving." I froze, not understanding what was happening. Moving? Why? Our house wasn't perfect, but it was where I grew up, where I knew every crack in the walls and every creak of the floorboards. "We're going to live with your grandmother in Heinsberg," my mother added, her voice gentle but strained. "She's getting old and needs someone to take care of her, and we need a fresh start." I didn't ask many questions because I knew my parents didn't like being questioned. But inside, everything started to feel chaotic. Why so sudden? My parents had never mentioned taking care of my grandmother before. They rarely even spoke to her except for brief phone calls during the holidays. Something felt off, but I was just a 13-year-old kid. What did I know besides obeying my parents? So we began packing. Cardboard boxes piled up in the living room, my favorite books were stuffed into plastic bags, and the house I thought would be my home forever gradually became empty. In the days leading up to the move, I started noticing small details I hadn't paid attention to before. My parents would whisper to each other in the kitchen, their voices low and urgent as if they were hiding something from me. Once I overheard my mother mention money and plans, but when I walked in, they immediately fell silent and pretended to talk about the weather. I didn't think much of it, but a heavy atmosphere began to envelop our family. My father became more irritable, snapping at me over trivial things like leaving a glass of milk on the table too long. My mother, on the other hand, would look at me with sad eyes as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. One afternoon, as I was packing my books into a box, my father came into my room holding an old photograph. It was of my grandmother, taken long ago when she was young. In the photo, she stood in front of a field wearing a white blouse, her long black hair flowing with a gentle but resolute smile. "Your grandmother was a beautiful woman," my father said, his voice pensive. "And strong. You have to remember that, Beckett." I nodded, but inside I wondered why he was talking about her so much, as if he was trying to convince himself of something. Stories about my grandmother kept replaying in my mind. She was the woman who overcame every hardship, raised her son alone, and faced the world on her own terms. I began to imagine the house in Heinsberg where we were about to move. I had only been there a few times as a young child, but I remembered it as an old wooden house on a dirt road, surrounded by sprawling fields of grass. I wondered what life there would be like. Would my grandmother still slip me butterscotch candies? Would I find a quiet corner in that house to continue my daydreams as I had in Colchester? But deep down I felt uneasy. Something about this move wasn't as simple as taking care of an elderly person, as my parents claimed. I didn't know exactly what it was, but the feeling grew, like a dark cloud hovering overhead. I started noticing how my parents looked at each other, how they avoided my gaze when talking about my grandmother. Once I overheard my father say to my mother, "Everything will be fine, Catherine. We just need to stick to the plan." What plan? I didn't dare ask, but my heart raced every time I thought about it. And then the night before we left Colchester, things began to come into focus in a way I never could have expected. That night, the air in Colchester was cool, the early summer chill forcing me to pull the blanket up to my chin. The house was nearly empty, with only a few cardboard boxes scattered in the corner of the living room, and the sound of the wind whistling through the old window frames. I lay on my familiar bed, but my mind refused to settle. The whispers of my parents from the kitchen below drifted up like a haunting, wordless melody. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, honestly. But that gnawing unease, the feeling that had been eating at my heart for days, urged me to sit up and tiptoe out of my room. The wooden stairs creaked under each step, and I paused several times, my heart pounding, terrified that my parents would notice. I went barefoot, my hands gripping the railing tightly, trying not to make a sound. As I neared the kitchen, I pressed myself against the wall, where the dim, yellowish light from the table lamp spilled out. My parents were seated around the old wooden table, their voices so low they almost blended with the wind outside, but their words, each one sharp as a blade, cut into me. "Leonard, are you sure?" My mother's voice trembled as if she were trying to stay calm. "If your mother finds out, we'll have no way out." "How would she find out?" my father replied, his voice firm but laced with a coldness unlike the father who used to laugh and joke with me every evening. "My mother's old, Catherine. She won't suspect her own son. As long as we can get that safe open, we'll have enough money to start over. No debts, no worries. Everything will be fine." I stood there, frozen as if encased in ice. A safe? Money? I knew my grandmother had a small safe in her room. My father had mentioned it before, but I always thought it was just for storing papers or a few trinkets. What were they talking about? Were they planning to steal from my grandmother? The woman my father always called the strongest person he'd ever known? My heart raced so fast I feared they'd hear it. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to breathe as quietly as possible, but my mind was spinning. But what about Beckett? My mother hesitated, her voice dropping as if the mere mention of my name frightened her. What if he finds out? He's smart, Leonard. He'll figure it out. My father let out a dry, humorless chuckle. He's just a kid, Catherine. He won't suspect a thing. Just tell him we need the money to fix up Grandma's house or something like that. He'll believe it. My face flushed, a rush of heat surging through me. They were talking about me, about deceiving me, as if I were just a naive child they could easily manipulate. But what hurt most wasn't their words. It was the realization that my parents, the people I loved and trusted, were coldly plotting to betray my grandmother. The woman who had raised my father alone, who had endured so much hardship, was now the target of her own son's scheme to steal her money. I wanted to burst in and confront them, to demand why they would do such a thing. But my feet felt nailed to the floor. I was afraid that if I faced them, I'd see a version of my parents I didn't recognize. One that wasn't the comforting figures who hugged me every night, taught me to ride a bike or read stories to me. So I just stood there, listening as they continued. The key to the safe is somewhere in her room, my father said, his voice dropping as if he were visualizing the plan. My mother has a habit of hiding things in odd places, under the bed, in a drawer with her clothes, or even in that old tin box she used for cookies. If we can't find the key, we can try guessing the combination. I bet she used my birthday, or maybe Beckett's. My mother was silent for a moment, then let out a sigh. I don't like this, Leonard, but we don't have any other choice. The debts are choking us. If we don't pay them, they'll take everything. I couldn't listen anymore. I backed away, step by careful step, until I was back in my room. I closed the door and sat on my bed, my hands trembling. My world felt like it was crumbling. My parents, the people I'd always thought were good, were plotting to steal from my grandmother. They weren't just betraying her, they were betraying me, the son they thought was just a kid. I lay down, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the fragments in my mind. But the more I thought, the more frightened I became. I was scared that the family I loved was just a facade, hiding dark secrets I'd never dared to face. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay there, listening to the ticking of the clock in the darkness, each second striking my heart like a hammer. I thought about my grandmother, her gentle smile, the butterscotch candy she'd slip into my hand. I thought about the stories my father told about the resilient woman who overcame every hardship to raise her son. And I thought about myself, a helpless 13-year-old boy, powerless against what was unfolding. But deep inside, a small spark began to ignite. I couldn't let my parents do this to her. I couldn't let them destroy the one thing left in this family, my grandmother's trust. The next morning, we left Colchester. I sat in the back seat of the car, watching our wooden house fade into the distance through the window. My parents were quiet, only occasionally exchanging brief words about the weather or the route. I said nothing, but in my mind, a vague plan was starting to form. I didn't know what I could do, but I knew one thing. I had to protect my grandmother, even if it meant standing up to my own parents. The drive to Heinsberg felt longer than I expected, or perhaps it was just the heavy atmosphere inside the car, thick as lead. My father drove, his eyes fixed on the winding dirt road, while my mother sat beside him, her hands gripping the edge of her seat as if trying to hold back something. I stared out the window, watching the green fields stretch endlessly on both sides, dotted with maple trees beginning to turn golden. Heinsberg appeared before me, a quiet little town where time seemed to slow down, where old wooden houses stood silently along dirt roads and white picket fences. I had never stayed here long, but every visit brought a strange sense of peace, as if this place could embrace you and soothe any pain. My grandmother's house sat at the end of a dirt road, nestled beside a wide grassy field. It was a single-story wooden house, its white paint faded, its deep red tiled roof covered in green moss. The front door opened to a small porch adorned with vibrant red geraniums in hanging pots, and an old armchair where I remembered my grandmother sitting in the afternoons, reading or knitting. As the car came to a stop, I heard the hum of insects and caught the faint scent of freshly cut grass in the air. Everything here was simple, orderly, just as I imagined my grandmother, a woman who had survived countless hardships with care and resilience. My grandmother was waiting at the door, her small frame clad in the familiar gray sweater, her silver hair neatly pinned up. When she saw us, she smiled, a gentle smile, not overly warm, as if she were keeping a careful distance. "Come in, everyone," she said, her voice low and warm. "Don't leave your things out there, it's going to rain soon." She stepped forward to hug me, a light but firm embrace, and I caught the faint scent of lavender soap on her sweater. In that moment, I felt a strange warmth, as if she were a safe haven amidst the storm brewing in my heart. My parents hurriedly carried our belongings inside, tossing out polite remarks about being excited to be here and taking good care of her. I watched them, my heart heavy. Their words sounded so hollow, especially after what I'd overheard the night before. I wanted to scream, to run to my grandmother and tell her everything, but I held back. I was afraid she wouldn't believe me. I was afraid she'd look at me with pity, as if I were just a kid with an overactive imagination. And most of all, I was afraid of facing the truth that my family was no longer the one I thought I knew. The first few days at my grandmother's house passed in a strange rhythm. Her home was small but tidy, every corner bearing her touch, from the wooden bookshelf filled with old books to the dried flower arrangement on the dining table. The living room had an old fireplace above which hung a black and white photo of my grandmother and my father when he was young, both smiling brightly beside an apple tree. I loved looking at that photo. It made me think of a time when things were perhaps simpler, before dark secrets crept into our family. My grandmother lived simply, almost ascetically. Breakfast was usually just toast with homemade jam, and dinner was potato soup or a meat stew. She didn't like noise, but she always showed me a special kind of gentleness. Once she called me out to the porch, handed me a piece of butterscotch candy and said, "You're growing up, but I know you still like these." I smiled, biting into the candy, its sweetness melting in my mouth, but my heart felt bitter. I wanted to tell her about my parents, about their plan, but every time I looked into her eyes, kind and trusting, I couldn't find the courage. One evening, when my parents went out for a walk, which I knew was an excuse to discuss their plan further, I decided to tell her. We were sitting in the living room. She was knitting a scarf, and I was holding an old science book I'd found on her shelf. "Grandma," I began, my voice trembling, "I need to tell you something." She looked up, giving me a gentle smile. "Go ahead, Beckett. You know I'm always here to listen." I took a deep breath and spilled everything. I told her about what I'd overheard the night before we left Colchester, about my parents' plan to steal the key to her safe, about their scheme to stage a fake burglary. I spoke quickly, as if slowing down would sap my courage. When I finished, my chest felt heavy, waiting for her reaction. But she only smiled, a kind but sad smile. "Beckett, you're a smart boy," she said, setting her knitting needles down. "But sometimes your imagination runs too far. Your father is my son. No matter what happens, I know he's not a bad person. Don't worry, everything will be fine." She reached out and patted my head, as if I were just a child with silly worries. I sat there, helpless, feeling as if I'd been doused with cold water. She didn't believe me. She believed in my father, the son she'd sacrificed her life to raise. I wanted to scream to convince her, but looking into her eyes, I knew I couldn't change her mind. Not now. I just nodded, forced a weak smile, and returned to my room, my heart heavier than ever. But deep inside, the spark of determination still burned. If she didn't believe me, I would take matters into my own hands. I would prove I wasn't imagining things. I would protect her, even if it meant confronting my own parents. In the days that followed at my grandmother's house, I became a silent shadow, observing everything with sharper eyes than ever before. Her old wooden house, with its creaking walls and the faint scent of pine in the air, was no longer just a refuge. It had become a quiet battlefield. I knew my parents were moving forward with their plan, and if I didn't act quickly, they would succeed before I could do anything. Every action, every word of theirs became a clue in the dangerous game I was forced to play. My father started spending more time in my grandmother's room, using excuses about fixing small things. One morning, I saw him standing on a chair, fiddling with a light bulb on her ceiling, muttering something about helping her save electricity. But his eyes weren't focused on the bulb. They darted around the room as if searching for something. I lingered just outside the door, pretending to read a book, but my heart was pounding. I knew he didn't care about the light bulb. He was looking for the key or any clue that could lead to the safe they had talked about that night in Colchester. My mother was more subtle. She would sit with my grandmother at the kitchen table, brewing tea and chatting about trivial things like the weather or the price of vegetables at the market. But I noticed how she slipped in odd questions. "Mom, have you ever thought about writing down important numbers?" she asked once, her voice sweet as if merely curious. "You know, things like codes or special dates. I hear older people sometimes forget." My grandmother laughed it off. "Oh, Catherine, I may be old, but I'm not senile yet. I remember everything I need to." My mother nodded, smiling, but I saw her hands tighten around her teacup, as if hiding her frustration. I started paying attention to smaller details. One afternoon, when my grandmother went to the pharmacy a few miles away, I saw my father slip into her room. He closed the door, but not completely, leaving a small gap. I stood in the hallway, my heart racing so fast I feared he'd hear it. Through the crack, I watched him rummage through her desk drawers, flipping through old notebooks, even checking under the small rug by her bed. He moved quickly but carefully, like a seasoned thief. I wanted to scream, to rush in and stop him, but I held back. I needed proof, something undeniable that would force my grandmother to see the truth. The mix of helplessness and anger kept me awake at night. I lay on the single bed in the small room my grandmother had prepared for me, staring at the cracked wooden ceiling. The image of my father searching her room haunted me, like a slow-motion film playing on a loop. I thought about my grandmother, her gentle smile, and the way she trusted my parents blindly. She didn't know they were exploiting that trust, turning her into prey in her own home. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, I decided to test my parents. Pretending to be naive, I asked a question I'd been mulling over all day. "Grandma, what's in that safe in your room? It looks so big." The air at the dinner table seemed to freeze. My father stopped chewing, his spoon of soup hovering mid-air. My mother shot a quick glance at him, then forced a laugh. "Beckett, you're too curious for your own good," she said, her voice a little higher than usual. "Don't worry about grown-up matters." My grandmother, as always, just smiled kindly. "You're curious like your father was at your age," she said, patting my head. "The safe?" "Just some old things, papers, a few odds and ends. Nothing exciting." She spoke lightly, but I caught my parents exchanging a look of people who had just found the final piece of a puzzle. That night, lying in bed, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. My grandmother didn't believe me, but I couldn't let my parents go on. I had to do something, anything, to stop them. I didn't have strength or authority, but I had one thing my parents didn't expect: the cleverness of a 13-year-old boy and a burning determination to protect the woman who loved me unconditionally. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and in the darkness a plan began to take shape in my mind. A bold, reckless plan that could change everything. I wasn't a hero from the adventure books I used to read. I was just a scrawny kid with messy hair and glasses that kept slipping down my nose. But I had my wits, and I knew how to use them. In the days at my grandmother's house, I observed, memorized, and analyzed every detail. My parents thought I was naive, just a child they didn't need to worry about. They were wrong. I would expose them, catch them in the act, so my grandmother could no longer deny the truth. My plan began in my grandmother's basement. One morning when my parents went out for their usual walk, their familiar excuse to whisper their secrets, I snuck downstairs. The basement was dusty, lit by a dim bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting faint light on old wooden crates and cobweb-covered furniture. I found an old cardboard box containing a science kit my father had bought me when I turned 10. It wasn't anything fancy, just springs, rubber bands, and some plastic pieces for simple experiments. But to me, it was a treasure trove. I smiled for the first time in days as an idea sparked. I would make a trap, a powder trap. The idea came from a science book I'd read about creating simple trigger mechanisms. I took a small spring and attached it to an old tin box I found in a corner. Inside the box, I poured red and green powder from the science kit, mixing in some flour from my grandmother's kitchen for extra effect. The mechanism was simple. When someone opened the lid, the spring would snap, spraying powder all over them. If my parents tried to open the safe, they'd be marked, unable to deny it. I worked all morning, my hands covered in dust and powder, my heart racing with both excitement and anxiety. Every small sound from upstairs, my grandmother's footsteps or the creak of a door, made me jump, afraid of being caught. But the powder trap was only part of the plan. I needed stronger evidence, something my grandmother couldn't dismiss. I remembered the old phone she'd given me for my 12th birthday. A clunky Nokia with no features except calling and recording. I checked the battery. It still worked. A second idea formed. I would record my parents. Every night they sat in the living room whispering about their plan when they thought I was asleep. I decided to hide the phone there behind the bookshelf where they'd never notice. I tested it by recording my own voice and played it back. The quality was clear enough to capture their secret conversations. I smiled, feeling like a detective in a movie, but deep down I knew this wasn't a game. This was a fight to protect my grandmother. To keep my parents off guard, I started acting like an innocent kid. One evening, as we ate my grandmother's potato soup, I deliberately asked, "Dad, does Grandma's safe have gold in it? In the movies, safes always have gold." My father laughed loudly, but I saw a flicker of wariness in his eyes. "You've been watching too many movies, Beckett," he said, patting my shoulder. "Grandma's safe just has papers. Don't worry about grown-up stuff." My mother looked at me, her smile forced, and I knew I'd planted a seed of doubt in their minds. They thought I was clueless, and that was my advantage. Every night I checked the phone, listening to the recordings. Most were just mundane conversations, but I was patient. I knew they'd eventually talk about their plan. Meanwhile, I perfected the powder trap, hiding it carefully in a corner of my room, waiting for the chance to place it in the safe. I didn't know how to open the safe, but I was betting my parents would figure it out. And when they did, I'd be ready. I lay in bed, staring into the darkness, feeling both terrified and exhilarated. My plan wasn't perfect. If it failed, my parents might be furious, maybe even kick me out. But I didn't care. I thought of my grandmother, her gentle eyes, and the way she trusted my parents blindly. I couldn't let her be hurt. I would catch them in the act, no matter the cost. The fateful night came sooner than I expected. It was a Saturday evening, with faint moonlight slipping through the gaps in the curtains, casting weak streaks of light across the wooden floor of my room. I lay still, my ears straining to listen. From the living room, my parents' whispers drifted in, clearer this time, as if they were growing impatient. I slipped out of bed, clutching the old Nokia phone, checking its battery one last time before placing it behind the bookshelf as usual. I pressed the record button, my heart pounding, praying they would say something incriminating enough to serve as evidence. "Tomorrow," my father's voice was low but sharp, "you'll take my mother to the market. I'll stay behind and open that safe. I think I figured out the combination. Yesterday, she mentioned Beckett's birthday by accident. She loves that kid, so I bet she used his date. I stood pressed against the door, my breath catching in my throat. My birthday? My grandmother used my birthday as the safe's combination? A wave of emotion surged through me, warm but painful. She loved me that much, yet my parents were using that very love to betray her. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms, trying to suppress my anger. When she's gone, everything has to look normal, my mother continued, her voice trembling but resolute. We'll take the money and jewelry, then close the safe as it was. She won't suspect a thing. I returned to my room, my mind reeling. They knew the combination. They were ready to act. I couldn't hesitate any longer. That night, when the house had fallen silent, I crept into my grandmother's room. She was fast asleep, her breathing steady, her kind face peaceful under the moonlight. I looked at her, my heart aching at the thought of the pain that awaited her. But I had no choice. I knelt beside the small safe in the corner of her room, a weathered steel box tucked behind a curtain. Taking a deep breath, I entered my birthday, August 15th, 1994. A soft click sounded and the safe opened. Inside were neatly tied stacks of cash, a small jewelry box, some insurance documents, and a bank savings book. My hands trembled as I touched them, feeling as if I were holding my grandmother's entire life, years of saving and scrimping now targeted by her own son. Carefully, I took everything out and placed it into a small cloth bag I hid under my shirt. Then I set the powder trap inside the safe, ensuring it would activate the moment someone opened the inner drawer. I double-checked everything, my heart racing so fast I feared my grandmother would wake. But she slept on, oblivious. I left her room, hid the bag under my bed, and lay down, eyes wide open in the darkness, waiting for tomorrow. The next morning, everything unfolded as my parents had planned. My mother invited my grandmother to the market in town, saying she wanted to cook a big meal to thank her for letting us stay. I insisted on going along, claiming I wanted to buy a new book. My mother hesitated, but my grandmother smiled and patted my head. Come with us, Beckett. You'll like the market. My father stayed behind, saying he needed to fix the back fence. I knew he was waiting for his chance. On the way to the market, I sat in the back seat pretending to read a book, but my mind was focused on what was about to happen. I had hidden an old toy camera, one of those cheap ones I used to record my science experiments, in my grandmother's room, aimed directly at the safe. It wasn't high-tech, but it was enough to capture my father in the act. As soon as he opened the safe, the powder trap would go off, and the camera would record everything. 5 minutes after we left the house, I set my plan in motion. Mom, Grandma, I called out, clutching my stomach and feigning pain. My stomach hurts so bad I think I need to go home to use the bathroom. My mother glanced at me through the rearview mirror, her eyes narrowing with suspicion, but my grandmother, concerned, urged her to turn around. Poor thing. Let's take him back. We can go to the market a bit later. My mother reluctantly agreed, and the car turned back toward the house. When we walked inside, the scene before us made my heart skip a beat. My father stood in my grandmother's room, his face and shirt covered in red and green powder, the safe wide open and empty. He turned, his eyes wide with panic when he saw us. My mother gasped, covering her mouth, while my grandmother stood frozen, her kind eyes now filled with shock. I quietly stepped over to the bookshelf, retrieved the Nokia phone, and handed it to her. Grandma, I said, my voice trembling but firm, I think you need to hear this. My grandmother held the phone, her small hands trembling. She looked at me, then at my father, her eyes wavering between confusion and pain, as if searching for a reason not to believe what was happening. The room was suffocatingly silent, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock and my father's heavy breathing. I pressed the play button on the phone, and my parents' voices filled the air, clear and cold, like a knife slicing through the stillness. Each word, each sentence was like a stone hurled into my grandmother's heart. She stood there, her small shoulders trembling slightly, her eyes widening as my parents' voices continued, laying bare their plan to steal the money and jewelry and blame it on a staged burglary. When the recording ended, my grandmother let the phone drop onto the table, the soft clink sounding like a verdict. She said nothing, only stared at my father, her once kind eyes now filled with profound disappointment. "Leonard," she said, her voice low but razor-sharp, "what have you done?" My father stammered, scrambling for an explanation. "Mom, it's not what you think," he said, his voice shaky, the colored powder still clinging to his face, making him look both pitiful and absurd. "We were just trying to help manage your assets. I didn't mean—" "Don't lie," my grandmother cut him off, her voice rising in a way I'd never heard before, raw with anger. "Do you think I'm clueless? Do you think I'm so old and frail that you can exploit me, exploit my trust?" She turned to my mother, her eyes brimming with tears. "And you, Catherine, you went along with this? I welcomed you into my home thinking you came here out of family love, but it turns out you only wanted my money." My mother dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mom, I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "We're drowning in debt. We had no other way. I swear we didn't want to hurt you." But her pleas sounded feeble, like a fleeting breeze, too weak to soothe my grandmother's pain. My grandmother turned away, refusing to look at them. She waved her hand, her voice choked with emotion. "Get out, both of you. I don't want to see your faces in this room anymore." My parents stood there, silent, as if unable to believe what had just happened. Then my mother tugged at my father's arm and they quietly left the room, leaving me and my grandmother in a heavy silence. She sat down in a chair, her hands covering her face, and I heard soft sobs. I knelt beside her, my heart aching at the sight of her tears. "Grandma, I'm sorry," I whispered. "I tried to warn you, but I didn't know how to make you believe me. I just wanted to protect you." My grandmother looked up, her eyes red but still gentle as they met mine. She took my hand, her thin but warm fingers wrapping around mine. "Beckett," she said, her voice trembling, "you don't need to apologize. I'm the one who should be sorry. I didn't believe you, thought you were just a child with an overactive imagination. But you did what I couldn't bring myself to do. You protected me." She pulled me into a hug, tighter than ever before, and I felt her tears soak into my shoulder. She asked me to tell her everything, from the night I overheard them in Colchester to the powder trap and the toy camera. I told her all of it, holding nothing back, including the fear and anger in my heart. She listened, nodding occasionally, her eyes gleaming with a mix of pride and pain. "You're so smart, Beckett," she said, "but I wish you didn't have to do this. I wish our family wasn't like this." That night, my grandmother didn't sleep. I heard her moving around in her room, the faint crackle of the fireplace as she stoked the fire. I lay in bed replaying the day's events. I had done it. I had exposed my parents and protected my grandmother. But why did my heart still feel so heavy? I had won, but at the cost of my family falling apart. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain. I would never let my grandmother be hurt again. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was oppressive, like a dark cloud hanging overhead. My parents sat in the living room, their eyes red, their bags packed neatly by the door. They couldn't meet my gaze, nor could they face my grandmother. I stood in the corner, my hands gripping the edge of the table, bracing for the inevitable. My grandmother emerged from her bedroom, her small frame radiating a resolve I had never seen before. She wasn't wearing her usual gray sweater, but a crisp white blouse, her hair pinned high, as if preparing for battle. "Leonard, Catherine," she said, her voice calm but icy. "I want you both to leave. Today." She stood tall, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, though I noticed a slight tremble in her fingers. "I spent my whole life raising you, Leonard. I sacrificed everything to give you a good life. And this is how you repay me?" My father opened his mouth to speak, but then fell silent, his head bowed. My mother was crying, soft sobs echoing in the quiet room. "Mom, we're so sorry," she repeated, her voice frail. "We just wanted to get out of debt. We never meant to hurt you." But her apologies carried no weight anymore, like a breeze that couldn't soothe the wound in my grandmother's heart. My grandmother didn't respond. She just looked at them, her eyes filled with pain but no room for forgiveness. "I don't want to hear anymore," she said. "Leave, and don't come back." Her words were like a clean, sharp cut, delivered without hesitation. My parents stood silently, dragging their suitcases out of the house. As the door closed behind them, I heard my mother's sobs from the yard, but I didn't follow. I couldn't. I just stood there looking at my grandmother, my heart heavy. She turned to me, her expression softening. "Beckett," she said gently, "do you want to go with your parents?" Her question stunned me. Go with them? The people who betrayed her, who planned to deceive even me? I shook my head, my voice firm. "No, Grandma, I want to stay with you." She gave a sad but warm smile and took my hand. "Then stay. You and we'll get through this together." In the days after my parents left, my grandmother's house became quieter than ever. But it was a silence filled with emotion, as if both she and I were learning to breathe again after a storm. Each morning she woke early, making oatmeal with a drizzle of honey, the sweet aroma filling the wooden kitchen. I sat across from her, eating spoonfuls of oatmeal but occasionally glancing at the empty chair where my father used to sit. A pang of indescribable feeling hitting me. She didn't mention my parents and I didn't ask, but I knew she was hurting. I saw it in the way she slowly stirred her tea, her gaze distant as she looked out at the grassy fields through the window. About 2 weeks later, a man in a suit arrived at the house carrying a briefcase full of documents. He was my grandmother's lawyer. She called me into the living room where she sat with a cold cup of tea. "Beckett," she said, "I've decided to set up a trust. Everything I have, the money, the jewelry, this house, will be yours when you turn 18. I want to make sure you have a future, no matter what happens." I looked at her, at a loss for words. I was only 13 and the idea of assets or a distant future overwhelmed me. But I understood one thing. She was giving me her entire world, just as she had once given everything to my father. I don't know where my parents went after that day. They didn't call, didn't write, and I didn't look for them. Maybe they were ashamed, or maybe they were angry at my grandmother, at me. But I had no regrets. I chose to stay with her, the woman who loved me unconditionally, and it was the best decision I ever made. The years I spent living with my grandmother in Heinsberg changed me, not just because of what had happened, but because of how she taught me to view life. The small wooden house with its porch full of geraniums and the crackling fireplace each evening became the place where I grew up, not just physically but emotionally. I entered my teenage years at 13 with a heart full of scars, but also with a maturity no child my age should have had. Family, which I once thought was the safest place, turned out to be the most vulnerable. But through my grandmother, I learned that true love requires no conditions, and loyalty sometimes comes at the cost of painful choices. Life with my grandmother settled into a simple rhythm, but each day carried profound meaning. Every morning I woke to the scent of oatmeal wafting from the kitchen, where my grandmother was already up, wearing her old cloth apron and humming a folk song I didn't know the name of. She always brewed tea for both of us, the strong black tea she loved, and set a cup in front of me with a smile. "Drink up, Beckett," she'd say. "This tea will keep you sharp all day." I didn't care for tea, but I drank it just to see her smile. Those breakfasts weren't just about food. They were her way of reminding me that we had each other despite everything that had shattered. After breakfast, I helped her in the garden. The grassy field behind her house was a world of its own, with neat rows of crisp lettuce, ripe red tomatoes, and patches of daisies she planted just to make life prettier. She taught me how to sow seeds, water plants, and pull weeds, but more than that, she taught me patience. "Plants are like people," she said once, her hands brushing the soil. "They take time to grow, and sometimes they need to weather storms to become strong." I nodded, but I knew she was talking about us both. She had endured the storms of her life, from an abusive husband to a betraying son. and now she was helping me navigate my own. In the afternoons, I attended my new school in Heinsberg. The small school with its wooden hallways and the faint smell of chalk dust was a far cry from my old one in Colchester. I didn't make friends easily, partly because of my introverted nature and partly because I was afraid to open up. How could I trust anyone after what my parents had done? But the teachers were patient, and gradually, I found joy in science classes, where I could lose myself in experiments and forget the painful memories. I brought home assignments on chemistry or physics, and my grandmother would sit beside me, pretending to understand my explanations. Though sometimes she'd just laugh and say, "You're smarter than me now, Beckett." Evenings were my favorite time. After a simple dinner, usually potato soup or a meat stew, we sat by the fireplace, her knitting and me reading. Sometimes she shared stories from her youth, about the days she worked at the market to raise my father, or the nights she sat alone wondering if she could make it through. "I never thought I was strong," she said once, her gaze distant. "I just did what I had to do because I had no other choice." I listened, feeling the strength in her simplicity, and vowed to become like her, not for wealth or success, but for her resilience and unconditional love. But I wasn't always strong. Some nights, lying in bed, I thought about my parents. I wondered where they were, what they were doing, if they ever thought of me. The image of my father standing in my grandmother's room covered in colored powder, or the sound of my mother sobbing in the yard haunted me. I was angry at them, but deep down I still loved them. They were my parents, the ones who had hugged me, taught me to ride a bike, read me bedtime stories. How could I erase those memories? I learned to forgive, not because they deserved it, but because I didn't want anger to imprison me. But forgiving didn't mean forgetting. I would never forget what they did, never forget how they betrayed my grandmother, betrayed me. I realized my grandmother was also learning to heal. She never mentioned my father, but I saw the sadness in her eyes whenever she looked at the old photo above the fireplace, the one of her and my father smiling brightly by an apple tree. Once I caught her standing in front of it, her hand lightly touching the frame as if trying to hold on to a memory long gone. I didn't know how to comfort her, so I just quietly hugged her, letting her lean on my shoulder. She didn't cry, but I felt her pain, deep and silent like a river flowing beneath ice. As time passed, I grew from a timid 13-year-old into a more mature teenager. I began to understand that family isn't just about blood. It's about those who stand by you when the world falls apart. My grandmother was my family and I was hers. We didn't need much, just mornings with oatmeal, afternoons in the garden, and evenings by the fire. Those simple moments helped me heal the wounds my parents left behind. Each morning we woke early and walked along the red dirt road leading to the fields. She leaned on her cane, walking slowly while I stayed by her side, listening as she pointed out the birds that flew through in autumn. "See that sparrow?" she'd say, her voice as excited as a child's. "It's small, but it flies far. You're like that, Beckett. Don't let anyone tell you you can't fly far." I'd smile, holding her hand, feeling like the world was just the two of us walking under the early morning sun. In the evenings after dinner, we'd often play crosswords on old newspapers she kept from the weekend. She loved the tricky clues while I teased her when she guessed wrong. "You're getting old, let me help," I'd say, and she'd pretend to be cross, lightly swatting my hand. We'd laugh, our laughter filling the wooden house, chasing away the chill of the fading summer. Those moments I knew would stay with me forever. But I also noticed my grandmother was aging. Her steps grew slower, her hands trembled more when she held her knitting needles, and sometimes she forgot the name of a song or an old recipe. Yet her eyes remained gentle when she looked at me, as if I were all she had left in the world. I began to worry, though I didn't say it aloud. I feared the day she might leave me as my parents had. But I told myself that as long as I was here, I would care for her, just as she had cared for me. The years in Heinsberg flowed like a quiet river, carrying a mix of joyful and sorrowful memories. I grew from a 13-year-old boy with a scarred heart into an 18-year-old young man, ready to step into a wider world. My grandmother remained the guiding light on my path, though her light grew dimmer with time. I enrolled at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, choosing architecture, not just because I loved drawing blueprints, but because I wanted to build a sturdier world, the way my grandmother had built a safe haven for me amidst the wreckage of our family. The final days in Heinsberg before leaving for college were the ones I cherished most. Each morning I still woke early with her, walking along the red dirt road to the fields. She leaned on her cane, her steps slower than before, but she still pointed at the sparrows darting across the sky, her voice as lively as ever. "See that, Beckett," she'd say. "They're small, but nothing can stop their wings." I smiled, holding her hand, feeling the warmth of her frail fingers in mine. I knew she was talking about me, about the journey ahead, and I vowed never to let her down. When I started my freshman year, I returned to visit her often. The bus rides from Amherst to Heinsberg were long and tiring, but seeing her standing on the porch in her gray sweater, holding a piece of butterscotch candy, made it all worthwhile. We'd sit by the fireplace, sipping tea, playing crosswords, and talking about my dreams. "I want to build a beautiful house for you," I told her once, my voice full of excitement. "One with big windows so you can see the whole field from the living room." She laughed, ruffling my hair as she did when I was a child. "I just want you to be happy, Beckett. That's the most beautiful house I could ask for." But I knew time was not on our side. My grandmother grew weaker. Her hands trembled more, and some days she forgot the name of the road leading into town. I started calling home every evening just to hear her voice, to make sure she was okay. "Don't worry about me," she'd always say, her tone still gentle. "Focus on your studies, I'm fine." But I could hear the weariness in her voice, and each time I hung up, I prayed I could be with her more. The day I graduated from college at 23 is one I'll never forget. I stood on the stage in my cap and gown, holding my diploma, looking down at the audience where my grandmother sat. She wore the white blouse she'd worn the day she sent my parents away, her silver hair neatly pinned, her smile radiant despite the deep lines on her face. When I stepped down, she hugged me, a frail but loving embrace. "I'm proud of you, Beckett," she whispered, and I felt hot tears roll down my cheeks. But moments after the ceremony, as we walked to the car, she suddenly stopped, clutching her chest, her face pale. Panic surged through me as I called for help, but it all happened too fast. She had a heart attack, and before the ambulance could arrive, she was gone, right there in my arms. I knelt beside her on the campus lawn, sobbing like a child, calling her name in vain. My world collapsed again, but this time the pain cut deeper because I knew I had lost the most important person in my life. I returned to Heinsberg and held her funeral at the small town church. Neighbors and friends came to pay their respects, bringing daisies and words of condolence. The little church was filled with people, but I felt hollow. I stood before her coffin, gazing at her face, still kind even in eternal sleep, and told myself she had passed in peace, knowing I had grown into the person she always believed I could be. After 10 years of silence, I decided to inform my parents of her passing. I tracked down their number through an old acquaintance in Colchester. When I called, my mother's voice trembled on the other end, but she said little. "Thank you for letting us know, Beckett," she said before hanging up. I don't know how they felt, but I wasn't surprised when they didn't attend the funeral. Perhaps they were still angry at her or at themselves, but I no longer cared. To me, my grandmother was my family, and she would forever remain in my heart. After the funeral, I returned to the wooden house in Heinsberg, sitting alone by the fireplace. The crackling flames seemed to whisper memories of her, but the house felt achingly silent. I opened her old tin box where she kept letters, old photos, and an unopened piece of butterscotch candy. I held the candy, smiled, and tears fell again. As I sifted through the yellowed letters, I found an envelope with fresh ink addressed to me, to Beckett. My heart raced as if she were there, speaking to me one last time. I opened the envelope, my hands trembling. Inside was a single sheet of paper, her handwriting still neat but slightly shaky, a sign of her age. The letter read, My dearest Beckett, if you're reading this, I'm probably no longer here. I was never good at saying words of love, but you are the light of my life. You gave me a reason to keep going even when my heart broke over what happened with your father. I know you're hurting because of your parents, but don't let that pain bring you down. You are stronger than you know, and I believe you will live a life worth living, not for money or fame, but for the kindness and honesty you showed me. Forgive, but don't forget. And always remember, I love you forever. Your grandma, Helen Callahan. I folded the letter, tears falling onto the paper, blurring a corner of her ink. Her words were like a small flame, warming my heart amidst the pain of loss. She had known, always known, that I would need these words to keep going. I pressed the letter to my chest, feeling as if she were still here, holding my hand, guiding me through the darkness. She taught me more than I could ever express, about resilience, love, and standing up after life's blows. I learned that family isn't just blood. It's the people who sacrifice for you, who believe in you even when you doubt yourself. Her letter was the final testament to that love, and I knew I would carry it with me for the rest of my life. Now at 31, living in Burlington as an architect, I carry her lessons in every blueprint, every house I build. I want to create safe spaces where people can find peace, the way she did for me. And I want to send a message to anyone hearing this story. Life can hurt you. The people you love can let you down, but don't let those scars define you. Find the people who truly love you. Hold them close and live a life worth living, not for anyone else, but for yourself.